Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Today, Wired put out another one of their tech support videos, which if you've never seen are generally pretty interesting. They basically take an expert in a certain field and then ask them a bunch of questions off of the internet about that field. And the one that they put out today was an entomologist answering insect questions. So I figured I would do my reaction to this. Hopefully it's just adding stuff to whatever this woman is talking about and not having to contradict everything or correct everything. But I'll try to edit this down so that it's just the more interesting questions, because it's a pretty long video. It's about 30 minutes, but I'll link the video in the description if you want to watch it.
Why do praying mantis behead their partners after sex? So not all praying mantises actually eat their partners after sex, but many of them do, because it's a good strategy for the female. So females are about to lay an egg case, and that takes a lot of energy. Eating your mate is a really great food source because it's right there, it's readily available. You've just gotten the sperm that you need to fertilize your eggs. It's the ultimate nuptial gift that the male gives her. And it benefits him because if the egg case is well provisioned, then the chances are good that it will hatch. The babies will survive to adulthood, and then his genes will be passed on to the next generation. This mantis you can...
Okay, so there's a couple things. One, she mentioned nuptial gift. And this is something that a lot of insects and other invertebrates do, where the male will provide some sort of food-related or nutrition-related gift to the female in order to entice her to mate. And sometimes this is secretions from the male's own body, and other times it's little bits of food that are collected, things like that. But it's basically food used to not just persuade the female, but also to supply the eggs that still have to be formed with enough nutrition that they will survive. So mantises do tend towards cannibalism, not every time that they mate, but if the female is feeling low on nutrients, specifically fat and protein, in order to undergo this process called vitellogenesis, where she produces yolk for the eggs so that they can survive, she will begin to eat her partner, usually starting with the head. And part of that is because the male mantis can continue to survive and mate without the head, because not just mantises, but all insects have a dispersed nervous system. They can lose their primary brain, their cephalic brain, and still continue to function, at some level. They'll eventually die from the wounds, but they can continue the mating process and they'll survive for a little bit. So she can actually begin to eat the male while they're mating. And other creatures do this too. Black widows are very famous for this, but it doesn't happen every time.
What is the internal anatomy of a bug like? Mostly just goo. They don't have a circulatory system. No. They do have nerves that kind of flow throughout them, as well as fat bodies. But the external part of the insect is very interesting. That's made up of their exoskeleton. They have, like all hexapods, 3 pairs of legs. They have a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. For the winged insects, then in their thorax, which is divided up into 3 segments, the last 2 segments have pairs of wings. So there's 2 pairs of wings for a total of 4.
This is not correct at all. So this image is just from Wikipedia because I could find it really fast. But the internal anatomy of an insect is actually extremely complex. And not to say that the external parts aren't complex. The external parts are generally considered the most complex. Generally, if you take like an introduction to entomology course, one of the early things that you'll hear is to talk about insects, to understand insects, you have to understand the exoskeleton because it's so important to insect functioning. But the internal portions are just as complex. I'm not sure why she said it's just goo. They have very well-defined organs. As you can see in this, there's a number of organs already labeled. You have the heart, you have the digestive tract, you have the ventral nerve cord, you have the brain, you have the Malpighian tubules, which are basically the liver and kidneys. You have a complex reproductive system, and the rest of this isn't void space. You have hemolymph, which is basically their version of blood, but you also have a bunch of glands, like endocrine system glands. You have a ton of muscles, you have a ton of nerves. There's a lot going on there, as well as fat body, which people tend to think of as, fat, like mammalian fat, but that's not the case. In insects, fat, or what we call the fat body, is a number of different distinct tissues that have different structures, and they are metabolically active. They produce a bunch of hormones and things like that that the insect requires to survive, as well as assisting with nutrient storage and things like that. But just as an example, you have something like this. This is just the digestive tract of a moth, and you can see it's quite complex. There's a bunch of different structures involved in the digestive tract, and then you can compare this to the digestive tract of a crabbed beetle. It's very, very different. You have the respiratory system that I didn't even talk about in the previous images. You have a complex respiratory system in insects. In some flying insects, it's huge. It's full of these big vacuoles, these air sacs that they use to pump, similar to lungs, in order to move air around the body. And then, depending on the insect, you can also have extremely complex reproductive systems. This is the reproductive system of a queen bee. So you can see there's a lot going on here. It's not just goo. Part of the misunderstandings and part of our limits of knowledge of the internal morphology of insects is caused by our way of preserving insects. Most insects are preserved dry. They're pinned and dried. And during that process, the internal anatomy wastes away. It rots very, very quickly, and then there's nothing left to really examine. You have the option of preserving insects in alcohol, but that causes all sorts of other problems because alcohol tends to degrade all of the membranes associated with the insect, so then the body tends to fall apart. So there are limits to, what we can preserve long term. So there's not as much, interest and knowledge about internal insect anatomy, just from our own sorts of limitations.
PausRev25 asks, would cockroaches survive a nuclear war? Probably not. The heat and radiation ultimately would be so much that they would die. But we do know that cockroaches can withstand a lot of radiation, but also they can live a really long time without eating. A lot of cockroaches have these organs in their body called mosquitocytes. It allows them to store the food that they eat as nitrogen. And then during times of environmental stress or when they don't have food available, they basically remetabolize the food that's in the mosquitocytes. They can just eat from what is already within them. And then instead of excreting, they actually just restore the contents back in the mosquitocytes. So there are some species of cockroaches that actually don't have excretion whatsoever. That leads to this kind of myth that they'd be around even after a nuclear war. They probably would do better than you and I would do. That's for sure.
So she's right. Cockroaches probably wouldn't survive a nuclear apocalypse or anything, but also they're really good at surviving and sequestering poison within their body. So which is why they're so hard to kill with insecticides if you have them in your house. One of the things that they can do if they're exposed to any sort of toxic substance is many of them can sequester those toxins within that fat body that I was talking about, and it kind of seals it off so that it doesn't destroy other parts of the body.
I asked Google, what's the most dangerous animal? Why Google said a mosquito? See, I knew I wasn't tripping when people made fun of me of how terrified I was. Actually, mosquitoes have killed more people than any other animal. They are the deadliest animal on the planet. Not because mosquitoes themselves are deadly, but they vector deadly diseases. So diseases like malaria, yellow fever, chikungunya, dengue fever, West Nile virus, Eastern equine encephalitis, and so on. They all kind of hijacked the mosquito's natural feeding system and then get transported into humans, and they can cause severe illness or death. Males don't drink blood. Males, they drink flower nectar. But females have been selected to also give an injection into whatever they're biting, a pain reliever, and anticoagulant to try and prevent themselves from being squashed. When the anticoagulant and the pain reliever are injected, that's when the pathogen actually goes into your body.
So yeah, what she said here is correct. It's something like half of all people who have ever existed have died of malaria. So once you add up all the other diseases that mosquitoes transmit, it's easily the most dangerous thing on Earth. Interestingly, people don't seem to realize this because I guess they just don't know their history very well. But the United States used to be ridden with malaria. If you were on the Gulf Coast or the Mississippi Delta, even places like Philadelphia used to have regular malaria outbreaks as well as yellow fever outbreaks and things like that. And it's not until the invention of DDT and other insecticides that we managed to wipe out a lot of these diseases from North America.
Asks, so do mosquitoes have a specific blood type that they can have, or does it not matter? How many mosquitoes carry HIV? Mosquitoes don't vector HIV. It's not something to be concerned about. And they don't themselves have a certain blood type. They have something called hemolymph, and it just kind of flows in their open, smushy body. Often people wonder, do they prefer to have a certain kind of blood? Like, is O blood type the best type of blood? Some people tell me, oh, I have A blood type. I get eaten all the time. No, it doesn't matter whether you have O, A, or B. You will be equally likely to be bitten by a mosquito. Some people are very allergic to that kind of cocktail that the mosquito gives you, so they end up with really big bumps or really itchy bumps, almost like welts. Often people will say, well, I never get bit by mosquitoes. You're probably all being bitten by mosquitoes. It's just that some of you are reacting more than others.
Yeah, so there is some research that mosquitoes do get attracted to certain body scents. So some people produce certain pheromones or scents which are disproportionately attractive to mosquitoes. But, the research is all over the place with these sorts of things. Why do some people get bitten more than others? Why do some people react worse than others? I react quite badly to mosquito bites, whereas other people, never seem to have an itchy mosquito bite on them. As far as blood type goes, mosquitoes and other insects do have this thing called hemolymph. It's basically blood without red blood cells. So mammals have red blood cells because that's what we use to transport oxygen around the body. Insects don't do that. Insects passively absorb oxygen through a system called tracheae, which these trachea go through the body and they kind of passively suck in air and transmit that oxygen to their cells. So they won't have a blood type like we do with our red blood cells.
From the biology subreddit, how closely are bugs related to crustaceans? Is a lobster basically an ocean cockroach, or is it completely different? If you looked at a phylogeny or a tree of life of the group of animals called arthropods, you would see the crustaceans, things like lobsters, and the hexapods, things like insects, which is the group to which cockroaches belong. So lobsters are very related to cockroaches. You could call them an ocean cockroach, but you could also call them an ocean dragonfly, an ocean true bug, an
So going back to what she just said, showing this phylogeny. So the arachnids, crustaceans, insects, and myriapods, which are the millipedes and the centipedes and things like that, they are all related, but this sort of relationship isn't what we consider accurate anymore. Again, if I just pull this off of Wikipedia, this is what we call the pancrustacea. So the pancrustacea are the insects and the crustaceans, and they are very closely related, as it turns out. Although in this article that I pulled up, they call it the pancrustacea. The more accurate name is probably the tetraconata, which is referring to the structure of their eyes. Both crustaceans and insects have 4 different kinds of cones in their eyes. But up here, as a related group, you have the Chelicerata. These are the spiders and the scorpions and things like that. The hexapods here are the insects, and everything else are the crustaceans. The crustaceans came first. So the crustaceans evolved in the ocean, and then they eventually colonized the land, and a subgroup of them eventually became the insects. It's not that crustaceans are sea bugs. It's that insects are flying crustaceans. So the crustaceans came first.
asks, why is everyone afraid of tarantulas? Tarantulas are not the bad guys. There's actually no recorded deaths from tarantulas. All tarantulas have venom, but the venom usually is not anything that's going to kill a human. They do sometimes eat big things. Sometimes people have seen them eat lizards or snakes or birds even, but they're not out to get us. They're not out to harm humans in any way. They're slow-moving, ancient arachnids. Tarantulas can be really colorful. There are blue ones, there are pink ones, there are ones that have like kind of this metallic sheen. These are perhaps the fuzziest of the arachnids. They have hairs on their bum called urticating hairs, which are barbed hairs that they can kind of kick off with their feet, and they can be irritating, and that's one of their methods of defense. You can eat tarantulas. There are groups of people that actually roast them.
Yeah, so to go off what she was saying, she is right. You are very unlikely to be seriously injured or killed from any sort of spider. Even something as deadly as the Australian funnel web spider. There are antivenoms now. You're not likely to die. There hasn't been a death from them since the 80s, and they're the most dangerous spider on Earth. But a typical tarantula or a typical house spider, or even a brown recluse or a black widow, is not likely to seriously injure you. you might get a secondary infection, something like that, where you need to get medical attention or antibiotics because of that. But the venom itself, unless you have a complicating factor, is not likely to cause that much damage. And a complicating factor can be, small children, very old people, people with, some sort of disease that inhibits their ability to heal, things like that.
Do you have a stare down with an insect with compound eyes? Which lens am I supposed to look at? Insect compound eyes are made up of what we call ommatidia, or lenses. Dragonflies have tens of thousands of ommatidia. Light basically passes through it, gets kind of bounced around, and ultimately sends a signal to their cluster of ganglia that we call their brain. Insects also have light sensing organs, which are called ocelli. So I suppose if you wanted to stare down an insect, you could also stare at their ocelli, but they probably won't see you. Their ocelli just tells light and dark. So dragonfly eyes, because their ommatidia are kind of arranged in the front of their eye all the way around to the back of their head, they're actually able to see a pretty wide arc around them. Their eyes are not totally attached to their body. They have these hooks in the back of their neck. It's called the head arrestor system. When they're flying, the hooks are engaged and their head is very stable. But when they land, the hooks detach and then they can kind of look around and move their head. They're able to see a lot of different colors, which makes sense because dragonflies are very colorful and they use color for communication. They're really using their eyes for their vision to catch their food. They have a 98% success rate.
So with dragonflies and other insects in general, they do have these large compound eyes, and each of those facets, the ommatidia, each of those lenses, behind it has their own retina. So whereas we have like one big retina, complex retina in our eye, they have all these tiny little retinas so they can kind of focus each of those as necessary. Now, unlike humans or other mammals, most insects cannot move their retinas. So we can move our eyes around and focus that way on different things in our environment. Insects actually have to move their heads. This is a little different with spiders. Some spiders can move their retinas in order to focus their eyes on different things, but generally with insects, they can't really move. She did mention that they can see a lot of colors. They can see more colors than us, generally speaking. Like I mentioned with the crustaceans, the group themselves are referred to as the tetraconata because they have 4 color receptive, light receptive cones in their eyes, whereas like mammals only have 3. So they have a wider array of things that they can see.
They're really, really effective predators. Creston Funk wants to know, how much do insects know? What do we know about bug consciousness? I would say we don't know very much about bug consciousness. For a long time, people thought bugs didn't have consciousness and that perhaps insects were just hardwired to do certain behaviors over and over again until they died. Now we know that insects can make decisions. We know that they can learn. So there was a study by Lars Chitka. They gave bees a series of little balls they could play with. There was no reward or treat that they got for doing so, but they seemed to engage in this behavior, and the researchers interpreted that as play. And if they do that, maybe insects have consciousness.
So this is a touchy subject, and it's hard to talk about because when you talk about like what is consciousness, it's hard to describe. We don't generally have great words for the phenomenon of consciousness. So when you're talking about what is consciousness in something like insects that are so alien to us, it's hard to talk about. There have been similar questions with like, do insects feel pain? Because they don't really have pain receptors like we talk about pain receptors, but they do respond to things like anesthesia. But that gets more complicated because plants also respond to anesthesia. So and painkillers. So it's hard to talk about what's going on there. As far as like the bumblebee play paper that was published, when it came out, it made waves, but it's largely a kind of nonsense. You're really anthropomorphizing bumblebees. Because we didn't know what they were doing, we just kind of called it play. The authors interpreted it as play. There's no reason to assume that because play is a whole other sort of behavior generally associated with juvenile animals and people. It's a strange thing. It's hard to talk about these things because it requires you to anthropomorphize an insect, and they're just very, very different from us.
Son of Nothing asks, how do insect antennae work? So insect antennae have these tiny little pits in them, and inside are these little chemosensilla. There are odor molecules. Sometimes it's a pheromone. Sometimes it's things that they're interacting with in the environment. Those odor molecules kind of bind to the sensilla, and that triggers an electrical impulse that goes to the brain that tells this insect, in this case this cockroach, something about what it's tasting or what it's smelling. So on my arm right now is a blabberus, or a cave roach. Now on my hair, 1 second. I use a lot of coconut oil in my hair, and I think she's probably like, what is going on? You can see that the antennae are touching constantly, and that is her kind of trying to smell her surroundings and figure out what is happening. This cave roach you would commonly see in Central and South America, often on the barks of trees, especially if you're out at night. They're vegetarians, they're decomposers, and they help kind of shape the forests that we have. That hair product really freaked her out.
So she's correct with this. This is what those chemoreceptors on the insect antenna look like if you go really up close. This is a scanning electron micrograph. So each of these pits has a nerve associated with it, and these are kind of what they use to pick up scents in the air. So this is similar to the interior of our nose, for instance. There is something else at the base of an insect antenna, not in all insects, but in a lot of them, called the Johnston's organ, which is a little nerve bundle that exists in the base of the antenna, and it is used kind of like a gyroscope. Not so much when they're stationary smelling, but it helps keep them oriented when they're flying. So that when they're doing all these maneuvers, they don't get confused and crash. This keeps them, this Johnston's organ keeps them balanced, and that is also part of the function of the antenna.
If you place a same species ant from a colony to a new colony with other same ants, will it be accepted or rejected, or it doesn't matter to other ants? Ants in general are very warlike, so they don't like to interact with other individuals, even from the same species. They can smell when there's an ant that's nearby that's not part of their nest, and they will go to war. And definitely ants from different species are often at war.
So she is right about this with ants. Ants tend to be fairly aggressive, and they will defend. But interestingly, with other Hymenoptera, like honeybees, which are fairly closely related, they will sometimes accept foreign bees coming in, especially if those bees are coming in with a bunch of food. They will accept them into the colony. Beekeepers will also use tricks in order to combine bee colonies. If you have two colonies that are small and weak, you can combine them together. But you generally have to put them together with some sort of barrier so that they can get used to each other's scents. And that's why they, like ants and bees and things, normally would become aggressive with each other, is that different ants or different bees from different colonies have different scents and pheromones about them, and that's how they recognize each other as foreign. So if you let them get used to each other's scents, then it kind of all merges together.
A question from the ant subreddit. Which ants have the most effective armies? Like, hypothetically, if there were an ant world war, which ant species would win? Probably Argentine ants. For some reason, Argentine ants are actually able to move together as like a huge group, a super colony. These super colonies of Argentine ants are hundreds of thousands of individuals. It really does look like a black river. When I lived in Costa Rica at a field station, we'd have all of our stuff out. We'd see the ants coming. We'd leave the kitchen. They'd come through. They eat everything, kind of like in a cartoon. Every, carrot, every apple was stripped. They can really eat a lot in a very short period of time. So they are very good at what they do, kind of consuming things as they move. Some people say that all of South America is one giant Argentine ant group.
So this is true about Argentine ants, and they do form super colonies. I'm going to disagree, though, and say that the ant that would win are the slaver ants. And these guys are particularly aggressive. I believe they're an African species. But the kind of warrior caste of ants will distract another colony, and then the queen ant will go in, the slaver queen ant will go in, kill the other queen, and then roll around in her body and her corpse in order to absorb her scent. And then she begins to rule the foreign colony, and they take over. They take all of the babies and all the food and things like that by mimicking these other colonies. So they kind of infiltrate and take over. So maybe these slaver ants would take over the Argentine ant super colonies.
At L. Rose Stars asked, how did they find out dung beetles can navigate using the Milky Way? There was a research group that actually was kind of looking at how dung beetles were using the moon to navigate to where they needed to go. But then during a dark night when there wasn't a moon out, the dung beetles were still following the same route. And that led them to wonder, I wonder if there's something in the dark sky that they're still using for navigation. And they thought maybe it was the brightness of the Milky Way and the position of the Milky Way. So they actually took these dung beetles and they took them into a planetarium and they displayed the Milky Way. And indeed, the dung beetle was able to use the planetarium Milky Way to kind of go on its trajectory. So that was how they figured out that the Milky Way was being used by dung beetles for navigation.
So I've talked about this on this channel before. Everything she said is right, but the researchers that actually went about trying to prove this had very complicated methods, and it was super interesting. They developed little masks for the beetles so that they couldn't see the sky. They developed these artificial planetarium skies, which they would then shift the star patterns around. And it turns out that the scarabs can actually remember the position of the stars while they're rolling these balls of dung around. It's very complicated, but they are very aware of their environment. And they do have, it seems to be some sort of intermediate term memory in order to conduct this navigation using the stars.
Here's a question from Quora. How do creatures without any bones or cartilage, squids, cephalopods, insects, etc., get fossilized in stone? So when we think about fossils, we often think of things like dinosaur bones or hardened bones, but sometimes they're just kind of like a hardened imprint of an exoskeleton or things that are trapped in amber. Amber is basically fossilized tree resin or tree sap, and when it drips out, insects get caught in it, and then those are preserved over long periods of time. Some are kind of green, some are kind of this, amber colored. Jurassic Park suggested that perhaps you could take insects from amber and you could get DNA from them. And so far, we haven't been able to do that. But you can dissolve some amber and actually take the insect out. So what I have here is a compression fossil.
So insect fossils are very, very rare. Not so much the amber, but actually compression stone fossils are very, very rare. And part of that is because insects are relatively soft-bodied. They don't have any calcified parts really like that, so they don't have bones or shells, and so they don't preserve very well. The few compression fossils we have are frequently associated with coal pits. So these would be kind of primordial carboniferous coal swamps that large dragonflies and things like that got preserved in. But otherwise, we are very dependent on amber to learn about ancient insects. Part of the limit of that, though, is that trees didn't always exist. So insects are older than trees. When trees aren't around, there's no tree sap to preserve the insects that later becomes amber. So there are large gaps in the fossil record for insects because of this.
At Julius for Rum Earth asks, serious question. Why do lanternflies exist? What is their function? To annoy me, I presume. People have been concerned about spotted lanternflies for a couple of reasons. One, they're an invasive species, and whenever you have an invasive species, that can outcompete native species. But also, they have mouth parts that are like a straw with a pump. So they drink tree sap or plant sap. It basically means they have an all-liquid diet. Because they're drinking mostly sap, their poop is like a liquid kind of sugary poop, which we call honeydew. And when it drips onto the plants where it's feeding, it actually can encourage mold growth that can negatively impact crops.
So lanternfly has been a very annoying problem for the eastern half of the United States, but it turns out that it is not as severe a pest as we originally worried about. So they have a very large host range, which is what we were very concerned about because they will attack a lot of crops, especially fruit crops. But it turns out that they preferentially attack tree of heaven, which is their kind of native host. It's an invasive weed in the United States, but in Asia, it would be their primary host. So in a lot of areas with a lot of tree of heaven, like the northeastern United States, lanternflies are extremely abundant, but luckily they're not as damaging as we originally feared.
4091 asks, why does evolution cause bees to die when stinging? Over time, through natural selection, the ovipositor or egg-laying apparatus in bees has been modified to function as a stinger, and that is a protective mechanism for these bees. In honeybees, at least, when the sting happens, it enters the victim that's being stung, and because it's barbed, as the bee flies away, it actually rips off part of the abdomen. And so with no bum and with no back of the abdomen, then the bee dies.
So part of, I mean, everything she said is true, but part of the reason why they die is because mammalian skin is very soft and sticky. So that really holds on to the stinger. And this 1-2 punch of sticky skin and barbed stinger is what eviscerates the bee. So that stinger is very useful for defending the beehive from other insects. They don't die when they sting other insects, and it can be useful when defending against things like birds and stuff like that. It's just this weird interaction that the stinger has with mammalian skin that ends up being the death of them. With that, I'm going to stop there. There's chapters of this video I didn't react to just because it's very, very long, but I'll link it in the description and I'll talk to you guys later.